I hated going to Walmart, but that night I needed to grab a few things for work the next day. But as bad as being in that store was in general, things only continued to get worse. About halfway through the store, I suddenly had to use the bathroom really bad, so I started making my way towards the women's restroom that was closest to me. But when I got there, I saw that it was closed off and had a sign hanging on it that said closed for maintenance. I sighed and started looking around to see if I could find this sign for the other bathrooms, and that was when I spotted him. This tall, bald-headed man looked like he was staring at me. I tried not to be bothered by it, but I couldn't help it as I started noticing how bad he looked. And I don't mean that in an angry or mean way. He genuinely didn't look like he was in a good state. He was wearing a white tank top that was covered in dirt and had a bunch of tears in it, and jeans with one leg that was all torn up. I tried to ignore him, but every time I looked in that direction, he was staring at me. So I decided to just walk the opposite way and hope that I found the bathroom as I shopped. I began pushing my cart down the aisle away from the man, and as I turned out into one of the main aisles in the store, I looked back to make sure he wasn't following me. I was relieved when I saw that the man wasn't there anymore, but that quickly faded after a couple of seconds. Out of nowhere, I felt like someone was staring at me, so I looked over my shoulder again, and this time I could see the man walking behind me. He was about 10 feet away, and from what I could tell, he was walking with a limp. Again, he wasn't doing anything wrong at that point, so I just tried to brush off the terror that was making its way through every inch of my body and just continued through the store. Finally, I found the women's room and figured that it might be the only place that was safe for me at that moment and quickly went inside. I went straight into one of the open stalls and just stood there for a minute to catch my breath. I thought that I had escaped whoever that strange man was, but I couldn't have been more wrong. After standing in the bathroom for a minute, I heard the door open and close. And even though I hoped that it was someone else using the bathroom, I just knew that it was the strange man who had been following me. I held my breath and tried not to scream as I saw the shadow of the man approaching from underneath the stall, and eventually, I could see his torn up boots, which confirmed for me that it was him. I took a step back from the door and just hoped that the lock would hold until I could find a way out of the bathroom. I expected him to try to get into the stall, but for some reason, he was just standing right outside of it. I felt myself getting a little brave and decided to look through the crack of the stall to see what he was doing, but when I did, I almost jumped right out of my skin. As soon as my eye was lined up with the crack in the door, it locked with the man's eyes as he was also staring right through at me. I'll never forget the foggy blue pupil that was peeking the bloodshot redness of the rest of his eye. I couldn't take it anymore. I started screaming out, "Leave me alone! Get away from me!" An employee must have been close by because within a few seconds, I heard the door open and another man call out to me. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" he began to ask, but he stopped himself as he noticed the man standing outside of the stall. I heard the employee ask the man to leave and explain that it was a woman's bathroom, but the man didn't respond. He just let out a loud belting noise and began slamming his head up against the bathroom stall door. I tried my best to stay calm, but I couldn't help but panic and I began calling out for help again. I was happy to know that there were 2 other employees nearby that came running in and actually managed to get the man away from the bathroom and held him down until the police arrived. The man was arrested once the officers found a baggie that they believe was filled with a narcotic, which is why they think that the man was acting the way he was. No matter what the reason though, I left the store as soon as I could and haven't gone back since. I can't go into a Walmart without looking over my shoulder anymore. Not since I was a kid, really. I must have only been 8 years old when I went with my mom and older sister to get some clothes for the upcoming school year. It was after dinner time because my mom worked most of the day, but I was excited to finally get some new shoes. So excited, in fact, that I insisted that I wear them out of the store. My mom fought back at first, but decided that it would be fine as long as she had the tag for the cashier to ring them up. We finished up in the shoe aisle and started walking up toward the front of the store, but I saw that one of the shoes had come untied already. I tried to holler at my mom to wait up, but she and my sister must have been talking because they didn't hear me. It was no big deal though, or at least that's what I thought. I figured I could just catch up and started tying my shoe. Once I made sure that it was secure, I started walking out of the aisle and toward my family, who was now quite a bit ahead of me. That was when all hell broke loose. Out of nowhere, I felt a hand grab my shoulder from behind and pull me backward really quickly. Before I knew it, I was lifted off the ground. I frantically looked around to see who had picked me up, thinking that it was one of my uncles or someone that we knew that happened to be shopping too. It wasn't though. As soon as I realized that I was being grabbed by someone that I didn't know, I started screaming at the top of my lungs. The man who picked me up wasn't fazed though. He stayed calm and turned around as he started walking toward the entrance to the store. I began kicking and screaming as hard and loud as I could, but anyone who looked our way simply ignored me as the man smiled at them and said, "Sorry about him, he's hungry," as if I was some sort of baby. As we got closer and closer to the entrance of the store, I couldn't help but start feeling myself getting more and more tired. My kicking and flailing were getting weaker and weaker, and no matter how much I yelled, not a single person tried to stop him. I was starting to think that I would never see my family again as I noticed the lighting of the store change as we transitioned from the indoor area to the outdoor furniture section. I continued screaming as loud as I could, but it wasn't until we made it out into the darkness of the parking lot that someone finally stepped in. We had walked by a handful of cars, and I knew that my time to get away was running out, so as we passed one last group of people, I decided to try one last time. This time I looked right at them. It was a family with 2 kids, and this time I looked right at the woman who I assume was the mother and just called out for help. "Please, help!" I yelled without breaking eye contact. It took her a second for her to realize what was going on, but when she did, I saw her tap the man she was with on the arm and point at me. The next thing I knew, a man was yelling out for us to stop and chasing us down. That must have startled the man who grabbed me because I noticed that he loosened his grip on me for a brief second. I began kicking and flailing around again, and this time I managed to move enough to force the man to set me down. Without even thinking, I ran over to the family that had heard me crying out. The man continued to chase down the stranger who tried to kidnap me, but eventually came back saying that he got away. As the family escorted me back into the store, I saw my mom frantically looking around for me near the entrance. I ran up to her and gave her the biggest hug ever and told her what happened. She thanked the family that saved me, and we had to stay there to wait for the police to make a statement. But as far as I know, nothing ever came of it. Walking to and from work when I worked at Walmart used to be the most relaxing part of my day. I lived pretty much behind the store, so I would typically go in and out the back entrance to the store because then all I had to do was cut through the parking lot and cross the street and I was back at my apartment. One day when I was walking into work though, I noticed something strange. The parking lot behind the store where the loading docks were was typically empty. But that day there was a large brown van parked out near one of the dumpsters. I just assumed it was another employee though and honestly put it out of my head. That all changed at the end of my shift though when I was walking home. I left the Walmart through the entrance that I normally used, and as soon as I stepped outside, I remembered the strange van I had seen. I looked toward the dumpster, but I couldn't see anything sitting under the streetlights, so I figured they had left. I made it out into the dark parking lot and started pulling my phone out of my pocket when I heard something that made me look to my left. I stood in place and stared as I noticed a pair of headlights heading right toward me. I squinted my eyes as I tried to see if I recognized the car, and when I saw that it was a van, I started to get a bad feeling in my stomach. I took a step back because it looked like I was in the way of the path they were driving, but instead of just going right past me like I expected them to, they came to a screeching stop. I took another step back toward the store and got ready to run as I noticed the back door of the van slide open. I let out a shout and tried to turn around as two masked men jumped out of it. I wasn't quick enough though, as they grabbed onto me and pulled me into the van like it was nothing. I tried fighting back, but as soon as I started, I was smacked in the face with a hard object. I winced from the pain, and when I opened my eyes, I noticed that I was now staring down the barrel of a gun. I was trying not to panic, but as the van started driving, I couldn't help but cry out to the men asking what they wanted from me, but they didn't answer. Instead, they just started talking to each other in a language that I believe was Spanish. I felt myself sliding across the floor of the van as they turned out of the Walmart parking lot and onto the street. I looked around as the group was distracted and talking, and that was when I saw that there was no one sitting behind me. I tried to look nonchalant as I looked for the handle that would open the hatch in the back of the van, and when I found it, I looked back at the men who had grabbed me one last time. I checked to make sure they were still distracted, and as fast as I could, I rolled and crawled to the little lever that unlatched the hatch in the back of the van. I heard the men screaming as the truck opened, and because there were no seats in the back, I was able to roll right out. I didn't have time to worry if there were cars behind us that I was going to hit, but thankfully there weren't. I got the wind knocked out of me as I hit the ground, but I made sure to get back to my feet as fast as I could. I heard the van come to a stop behind me, and as I began running, I could hear the men chasing after me. Thankfully, I made it back to the Walmart parking lot and then entered the store without them catching me. I ran straight into the back room into my manager's office where I waited for the police to come. After talking with the officers and describing the men to them, they assumed that it was members of the cartel who had been suspected of being involved with human trafficking. There's no telling what would have happened to me if I didn't make it out of that van, but I'm just glad I did. I didn't walk to and from work much after that, only when I had to, but even then, I made sure to run as fast as I could. I was out at Walmart shopping for some food for the week and hair dye to fix my hair that weekend when I realized that I had forgotten my purse in my car. I brought my cart to the front of the store and asked if I could leave it there while I ran out and grabbed my wallet. The greeter was super nice and said it was fine. My eyes had to adjust to the dark parking lot, but I rushed over to my car. I was going so fast that I almost didn't notice that there was a piece of paper sitting on my windshield. I stopped for a minute and looked around to see if anyone was looking my way that may have left a note, but I didn't notice anyone, so I grabbed it. Since I was in a rush though, I decided to read it on the way back to the store, and it's a good thing too. I opened my car door and leaned into the back seat to grab my purse, and I don't know what compelled me to do so, but something seemed weird. So before getting back out of my car, I decided to look around again. That was when I saw a figure walking toward my car at a really brisk pace. I tried to see who it was and what they could have possibly wanted, but as they passed under the nearest streetlight, I noticed that they had the lower half of their face covered with a bandana. I let out a loud scream as I fumbled to close the door that I was leaning into the car from, and as soon as I pulled it shut, I locked it. By the time I looked up toward the driver's side window, the person had made their way right up to it. I double-checked that the door was locked, and I noticed him grabbing for the handle and trying to pull it open. I started to hyperventilate as I looked around trying to figure out what to do. I screamed again as I heard a loud bang and realized that the man outside of my window was trying to break through it. I continued to freak out because I didn't know what to do, but then out of nowhere, it was like I stopped thinking and my instincts just kicked in. I shoved my key into the ignition and turned my car on, and without even looking, I began backing out of my parking lot as the man continued to punch the car window. I screamed as I heard a loud crash and saw glass flying everywhere. Just as I was pulling out, he managed to smash through the window. Thankfully, I was already in motion though. I backed out of the spot and then quickly put the car into drive and rushed out of the Walmart parking lot as fast as I could. I made it back to my house without any problems when I realized that I still had the note clutched in the palm of my hand. Out of curiosity, I decided to open it, and when I did, I was horrified. All the note said was "turn around." That was when I realized that the man had planned on attacking me as I was reading the note. If I hadn't been in such a rush, I might not have made it into my car in time for me to get away. I returned to Walmart the next day to do my shopping, but that time I brought my husband with me just in case. While I worked at Walmart, there was this really weird coworker that used to always ask me if I needed a ride home from work. Now, at first I thought he was just being polite or looking for a friend or something, but I always got the creeps from him for some reason. That being said, one day my car was in the shop and I actually needed a ride home. I didn't go into work planning to ask him for a ride, but if he asked, I wasn't going to say no thank you this time. And as always, once we started stocking the shelves, out of the blue he asked me, "Hey, do you need a ride home, man? Our streets are close to each other." And instead of saying no thank you, this time I told George that I would love a ride home. I even offered to pay for food if he wanted to stop and grab some McDonald's. He was really excited about it, and I really thought that it wasn't going to be that bad. Boy, was I wrong. We both finished our shifts at 11 that night, and I waited for George to clock out before walking to his car. It was a beat-up looking Honda Civic, but he seemed really proud of it. And honestly, by that point, I really was thinking that George had just been looking for a friend that whole time. I got into the car and asked him again if he wanted me to grab him a bite to eat, and he said that he'd rather just get home. And it was when I went to shut the door that I noticed something strange about the car. There was no interior handle on my door. I asked George what happened, and he just said that the car came that way when he bought it and to close the door by pulling the window crank. I shrugged and did as he instructed, and before I could even put my seatbelt on, he was already pulling out of the parking lot. He quickly whipped the car through the parking lot and pulled out into the street without even putting his blinker on. I tried to tell him to slow down, but it was like he was in a trance and couldn't hear a word I was saying. I began looking around as this sinking feeling started to set in. I looked back down to the door handle thinking that something was off about the fact that it wasn't there. I looked at George and asked him why he never got it fixed, and that time he heard me. For some reason, his face dropped into a sort of scowl as soon as I brought up the door, and his demeanor changed entirely. Without looking at me, he started talking. 3 years, he said. I asked him what he meant, and he said, 3 years it took me to get you. I started looking around again, and then asked him to pull over because I didn't feel comfortable anymore. But he didn't respond. He just kept muttering the words, 3 years, over and over again. I knew I had to get out of the car as fast as I could, but there was no handle to open the door with. That was when I remembered the window crank. I started trying to roll down the window as fast as I could, but I wasn't quick enough. My body began to spaz as I felt George press something up against my stomach. As he pulled it away, I could see that he was holding some sort of taser in his right hand and steering with the other. I pretended to be passed out because I didn't want him to hit me with it again, and he seemed to buy it. He continued to drive home as if nothing was wrong, and when I saw that he was focused on the road again, I made my move. This time I grabbed for the steering wheel and pushed it to the left so that we would drive into the guardrail on the side of the road. George was in shock from the crash, which gave me enough time to force his door open and crawl over him to rush out of the car. I started to sprint down the road and waved my hands in the air, hoping to flag down any car that passed by. The first one didn't bother to stop, but I was happy to see the second car slowly stopping in front of me. I begged them for help and told them what had just happened to me, and they ended up giving me a ride to the police station where I was able to report the incident and call my roommate to pick me up. George was arrested in his apartment, and to this day, I still don't know why he tried to attack me or why he had apparently been trying to for 3 years.